All right, let's go. Number 10. The black paste they made for their eyes. In the storerooms of the Louvre, there are Egyptian cosmetic containers that still hold their original powder. And in 1999, Philippe Walter and his colleagues published what was inside 52 of them, in samples running from roughly 2000 to 1200 BC. Four lead compounds came out of the analysis. Two of them are ores. Galena, the black lead sulfide mined at Gebel El Zit on the Red Sea coast, and cerussite, a lead carbonate. Somebody dug those out of the ground. The other two, nobody could have dug out of anything. Laurionite and phosgenite are lead chlorides. They form where salt water works slowly on lead, and they occur in usable quantity in Greece, Sardinia, Cornwall, and Namibia. Nowhere near the Nile. Walter's team concluded that the Egyptians were manufacturing them by what the paper calls wet chemistry. For 19 years, that extraordinary claim rested on mineralogy alone. Then somebody dated the powder itself. In 2018, Lucille Beck and a team at the French Atomic Energy Commission ran radiocarbon on lead carbonates from Egyptian containers, including 4 phosgenite powders taken from a cylinder carrying the cartouches of Amenhotep III. Natural cerussite in the same study came back at roughly 8,800 to 7,100 BC, because the carbon in a mineral is as old as the mineral. The phosgenite dated to 1,763 to 1,216 BC. The carbon in it came out of the air on the day it was made. That is not an ore. That is a product. The method survives, though not in Egyptian. Dioscorides sets out the synthesis in the 1st century, and it is lead oxide worked hard with rock salt in warm water. Christian Amator, one of the chemists who studied the powder, put the labor at around 30 days. 30 days of work for something to put on the face. But here is where the eye paint stops being decoration. Egypt had an eye problem on a national scale. Trachoma, ingrowing lashes, injuries, and infection run all through the medical papyri. And the Ebers Papyrus alone carries more than 100 eye prescriptions. In 2010, Issa Tapsoba, Christian Amatore, and their colleagues tied the makeup to the medicine. They put lead acetate onto human skin cells at 0.2 of a micromole, then measured what came off with an electrode held against a single cell. Nitric oxide production rose by about 240%. Nitric oxide is a signal. It calls immune cells toward an infection and widens the vessels that carry them. Their argument is that a trace of lead leaching into the film of tears was putting the immune system on alert in a country full of eye disease. It is an elegant idea. It is also cells in a dish, and what that experiment measured was a chemical release, rather than a prevented infection. Maribel Riesmeyer and her colleagues at Cambridge analyzed 11 coal containers in 2022, and their conclusion about what the ingredients were for is that we still do not know. What we do know is the metal. There is no safe level of lead in a child. The American reference value stands at 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, lowered in 2021 because the harm keeps being found further down than we expected. And the trade never ended, which is the disturbing part. In 2011, a 6-month-old boy in Boston reached a blood lead level of 13 after Tiro was painted on his eyelids from the age of 2 weeks. The powder was 83% lead. When Montserrat Filella and her colleagues bought 23 coal products across Europe in 2020, 17 contained lead. Some ran above 40% by weight, and some of those were sold to us as lead-free. In November 2025, the World Health Organization certified that Egypt had eliminated trachoma as a public health problem. The disease those 100 prescriptions were written against has been beaten in the country that first described it. The eye paint has not. It is on shelves in 5 countries in the same black powder, still doing the one thing about it nobody ever had to synthesize. Number 9. The stain on the teeth. Between 1962 and 1966, Robert Fox and a team from the National Museum of the Philippines worked through the caves at Lipuan Point on Palawan. In Duyong Cave, they opened a Neolithic burial. The man in it had been laid out with shell adzes and ornaments. 6 shells stood beside him, and one of them still held lime. His teeth were stained, Fox's radiocarbon date puts the burial at around 4,600 years before the present. That stain has stood ever since as some of the oldest evidence anywhere for a habit that now occupies several hundred million mouths. As evidence, it is thin. A color on enamel and a shell of lime is a suggestion, not a molecule. The molecules took another 60 years. In 2025, Piawit Moonkam, Shannon Tushingham, and colleagues published an analysis of hardened dental plaque from 6 burials at Nong Ratchawat in central Thailand. The graves date to about 4,000 years ago. 3 samples from one of them came back positive. The individual was between 25 and 35, tentatively female, buried with stone beads. In her calculus were arecoline and arecadine, the alkaloids of the areca nut. That is the difference between a stain and a chemical. Somebody 4,000 years ago had been chewing long enough to leave the drug locked into the deposit on her own teeth. The preparation is 3 things and a piece of chemistry. The nut of the areca palm, a leaf of piper beetle, to wrap it, and slaked lime. The lime is not a flavoring. It drives the pH of the mouth up, which releases the alkaloids, and converts arecoline into arecadine as it goes. Without the lime, the quid barely works. Every one of those duyong shells was a piece of equipment. Arecoline acts on the parasympathetic system, and users describe alertness, warmth, and stamina. It was also medicine explicitly in our own printed record. King's American Dispensatory Lists. Areca in 1898 under 2 words. Astringent and tenicide. A tapeworm killer. The book names choline as the principal responsible. So that is the shape of the thing. A stimulant that cleans the gums, settles the stomach, and expels the worms growing on a palm chewed with a leaf and a spoonful of burnt shell. What makes this entry belong here is what the same combination does over 30 years. In 2012, the International Agency for Research on Cancer published its evaluation. Betel quid with added tobacco is carcinogenic to humans group 1. Betel quid without added tobacco is carcinogenic to humans group 1. Areca nut is carcinogenic to humans group 1. The nut alone with no tobacco near it sits in the same category as asbestos. There is also a disease that belongs to the quid and to almost nothing else, and it is a disturbing one. Oral submucous fibrosis is a slow stiffening of the lining of the mouth in which the tissue is replaced by collagen the body cannot break down again. The mouth closes. Eating becomes difficult. Then speech. And between roughly 2 and 9% of cases turn into oral cancer. An estimate from 1996 put the world figure at 2.5 million people, and nobody has counted properly since, because the condition is not notifiable anywhere. Prevalence is not a fringe number either. Around 30% of Indian men chew areca nut. In Palau, it is 72% of men and 80% of women. Thailand banned consumption outright in 1941, and it is still chewed there. The often quoted estimate of 600 million users worldwide dates from 2002, which makes it 24 years old and never precise to begin with. What we can be precise about is the recipe. A nut, a leaf, and a pinch of lime to open the chemistry exactly as it was assembled beside a man in a Palawan cave before the pyramids. Something like 1 person in 13 alive is still using it. Number 8. The fungus on the leather thong. He was carrying 3 pieces of mushroom when he died, and they were not the same mushroom. In 1998, Ursula Peintner, Reinhold Potter, and their colleagues at the University of Innsbruck published the identification. 2 of the objects were fragments of the birch polypore, each threaded separately onto its own leather thong. The third was prepared tinder from a different species in his belt bag with the tools for making fire. So 1 fungus was equipment. The other 2 were something else mounted deliberately carried on the body. The man had been on the ice above the Tisenjoch in the Ötztal Alps since somewhere between 3,370 and 3,100 BC. Helmut and Erika Simon found him there in September 1991. He has since been examined more thoroughly than any other prehistoric human being. He was about 46, roughly 1.60 m blood group O. His lungs were blackened with soot. He had worn teeth several cavities an advanced periodontitis calcification in his arteries, and arthrosis in the hips, knees, ankles, and lower spine. He also had a parasite. A team of Viennese parasitologists, led by Horst Asbach, found whipworm eggs in his large intestine. In 1998, Luigi Capasso put the two facts side by side in The Lancet and drew a line between them. The birch polypore, he wrote, contains agaric acid and toxic resins that act as powerful purgatives along with oils that have antibiotic activity. His conclusion was that the Iceman knew about his worms and was dosing himself. It became the single, most repeated fact about the Iceman, except that it started coming apart almost at once. Two rebuttals appeared in the same journal the following year. One came from the mycologists who had made the identification. That is unusual. The other from Håkan Tunon and Ingvar Svanberg in Uppsala is the one that does the damage. They could not confirm from the standard literature that the fungus contains agaric acid at all, and the antibacterial data that did exist came from mycelium and culture liquid rather than from the fruiting body he was carrying. It is unsettling to watch a famous fact dissolve in 2 letters. In European folk practice, the birch polypore was barely a medicine. It went on wounds occasionally, and otherwise it was used for protecting metal and stropping razors. A modern review of the species lists betulinic acid lupeol and a set of polyporinic acids. Agaric acid is not among them. Then, there are the marks on his skin, and they have the same shape of problem. In 2015, Marco Samadelli and colleagues in Bolzano finished mapping them. They photographed the body 7 times at every position from infrared to ultraviolet because the pigment is charcoal on dark leathered skin, and there is almost no contrast left. The final count was 61 tattoos in 19 groups, mostly in parallel sets of 2, 3, or 4, and most of them sit on the lower back and on the legs between knee and ankle, which is where his joints were worst. In 1999, Leopold Dorfer, Frank Barr, and their co-authors argued that this was not coincidence. Of the 15 groups known, then 9 fell on the urinary bladder meridian, and 3 on the gallbladder meridian, and 3 acupuncture specialists placed them within 6 millimeters of classical points. They were proposing a treatment system in Central Europe, 2,000 years before the earliest Chinese description of one. It is an extraordinary suggestion, and the evidence has been thinning ever since. The group found in 2015 is on the lower right rib cage. It is nowhere near a joint. And in 2024, Aaron Dieter Wolf and colleagues took the technique apart. The tattoos were not cut into the skin and rubbed with pigment, which is what every therapeutic reading had assumed. They were punctured point by point, by hand. Puncture leaves rounded stippled edges. Incision leaves pointed ones. There is also a circularity in the medical reading that is hard to unsee. Where a damaged joint carries no tattoo, the explanation offered is that the joint must not have been hurting. Everything about this man is recoverable except the thing we want. We have his parasites, his arteries, his gallstones, his cavities, and his soot. We have 61 marks made 1 puncture at a time by somebody who took the trouble. Whether any of it was treatment is the only question anyone is really asking. And it is the one question his body cannot answer. Number 7. The hole drilled through a living tooth. In 2006, a team led by Alfredo Coppa of Sapienza University published 2 pages in Nature about a graveyard in Balochistan. The site is Mergar, one of the oldest farming settlements in South Asia. Its burials run from about 9,000 to 7,500 years ago. 11 teeth in that cemetery had been drilled. They came from 9 adults, and every one was a first or second permanent molar. The holes measure between 1 and 3 millimeters across and up to 3.5 deep. Some walls still carry concentric ridges left by the tool as it turned. The team tipped a bow drill with a flint head and tried it on human enamel. It cut a comparable hole in under a minute. A minute. Somebody had done this before. They had also done it to people who were awake. The rims of the holes are smoothed, which happens only when a living mouth goes on chewing across the drilled surface afterwards. One individual had 3 teeth drilled. Another had a single tooth drilled twice. But here is the part the paper is honest about, and it is the part everybody skips. Only 4 of the 11 drilled teeth showed decay anywhere near the perforation. 7 do not. Coppa's own sentence is that the motive is unclear. Decoration is a poor explanation because these are molars where nobody can see them. The practice ran at that cemetery for 1,500 years and then stopped. The evidence gets older and cruder. At Riparo Villabruna in northern Italy, there is a young man of about 25 who died 14,000 years ago. Gregorio Auxilia and colleagues found that the large cavity in his lower right third molar had been worked, with shallow V-shaped striations reaching the floor of the deepest lesion. The team scratched fresh molars with wood, which left nothing, and with bone, which left almost nothing. Then they tried a microlithic flint point. The striations were identical to his. 1,000 years later, at Riparo Fredian in Tuscany, somebody went considerably further. Both upper central incisors of one individual had their pulp chambers opened, then enlarged in a circle to depths of over 4 millimeters. Stuck to the walls inside was a conglomerate of bitumen plant fibers and probable hairs. That is a filling. Tar as a seal packed with fiber in a hole reamed out of the nerve of a front tooth by a person who then went on living. What that felt like is not in doubt, and it is genuinely horrifying. Near the pulp, human dentine carries around 45,000 open tubules in every square millimeter. Each one is a channel of fluid running down to a nerve supply that can reach 2,000 fibers in a single premolar. The pulp has one output: heat-cold pressure. A stone point turning against exposed dentine, all of it arrives as the same sensation, because pain is the only signal the tissue is built to send. Nothing in the prehistoric record tells us that anybody was given anything for it. The most recent addition to this list is 3 months old, and it is not one of us. In May 2026, Alyssa Zubova-Ksenia Kolobova and colleagues published a Neanderthal molar from Chigirskaya Cave in the Altai, dated to 59,000 years ago. The chewing surface carries a worked concavity 4 millimeters long and 2.5 deep, made of 3 linked depressions that run down to the floor of the pulp chamber with fine striations along the walls. Overlying those striations is polish that only forms in a living mouth. Their experiments with stone perforators took between 5 minutes and 50. Nobody has published against that paper yet, and the authors flagged their own doubts about it. None of this was cosmetic. Before antibiotics, an infection traveling from a lower molar into the floor of the mouth killed more than half the people it happened to by closing the airway. In the London Bills of Mortality in the 1600s, teeth were the 5th or 6th leading cause of death. That is a brutal piece of accounting, and against it a flint drill and 1 minute is not madness. It is arithmetic. What survives is the rim. On the Mariger molars and on the Chagirskaya molar, the sharp edge left by the tool has been worn round and smooth by ordinary chewing over months and years, in the mouth of somebody who sat still for it, and then got up and ate. Number 6. The ear they opened twice. The dolmen of El Pendon stands near Reynoso in Burgos. It was in use at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, and its final phase is an ossuary. The bones of close to 100 people were put into it. One skull in that pile is unlike anything else recovered from the period. It belonged to a woman. Her upper teeth had all been gone for a long time before she died, and the cartilages of her larynx were completely ossified. That process does not finish until around 65. She was old. Both of her ear canals had been cut open. In February 2022, Sonia Diaz-Navarro of the University of Valladolid published the analysis with colleagues from the University the Clinical Hospital in Burgos. The description is precise and not what the popular version says. Nobody drilled a hole behind her ear. The external auditory canal itself was enlarged backwards, upwards, and downwards on both sides, until it broke through into the mastoid air cells in the middle ear, and the opening measures 12 millimeters across on the right and 9 on the left. In modern terms, that is a radical mastoidectomy, and the authors argue it is the earliest one known. The next oldest is Byzantine. The diagnosis they reconstruct is the commonest lethal sequence in the pre-antibiotic world. An infection of the middle ear spreads back into the mastoid bone. The bone breaks down, pus collects under the periosteum, and the abscess bursts through the outer plate. They ruled out cholesteatoma because a small bony ridge called the scutum is intact on both sides. They ruled out tumors because those are rarely bilateral and kill too quickly. So somebody looked at a swelling behind an old woman's ear and decided to open it. The bone records what happened next in weeks. On the left temporal, there is resorption, only the pitted surfaces where bone is being taken away. On the right, there is resorption, then a layer of new deposition, and between them a clean reversal line. Resorption runs about a fortnight. The reversal phase takes another 4 to 5 weeks. She lived, long enough for one ear to begin rebuilding, and long enough afterwards for somebody to do it again on the other side. That is an extraordinary outcome for stone cutting through the wall of a skull. At the anterior edge of the left opening, there are 7 parallel cut marks, 2 to 4 millimeters long, V-shaped in section. A flint blade was recovered from the dolmen. It is 31 millimeters long. A specialist who examined it blind concluded it had been used for butchering and had touched bone. It had also been heated, though not past 350 degrees, because there are no fire cracks in it. The authors suggest it may have served as a cautery, then state plainly that they cannot say it was the tool. The paper contains one sentence that everything else hangs on. The operation, they write, would have caused unbearable pain under normal conditions. Their reading is that she was either held down by other members of the community or given something first. We have nothing from El Pendon to tell us what. The precedent they reach for is a claim of opium in Neolithic burials at the Gava mines outside Barcelona. That claim has itself been criticized in print for a methodology too poorly described to trust. We have good chemical proof that prehistoric people used psychoactive plants. We have no evidence at all that anybody used one for surgery. What the anatomy allows is a frightening margin. The facial nerve runs down the back wall of that canal. Behind it lies the sigmoid sinus, a vein wide enough to empty a person in minutes. Above is the floor of the skull, with the brain resting on it. Inward sits the labyrinth that carries balance and hearing. Somebody went in there twice, with stone, and came out the other side of it with a patient. She is one skull out of 100 in a stone chamber outside a village in northern Spain. We can reconstruct about 6 weeks of her life in clinical detail, down to the fortnight her bones spent dissolving, before it began to rebuild. Everything else she did in 65 years is in the pile with her, and there is no way to tell which of the other bones were hers. Number 5. The cuts around the tumor. 2 Egyptian skulls sit in the Duckworth Laboratory at Cambridge, catalogued 236 and E270. In 2024, Tatiana Tondini, Albert Isidro, and Edgar Camaros put them under a digital microscope and a micro-CT scanner. Skull 236 belonged to a man of 30 to 35 who died between 2686 and 2345 BC. On his palate is a large irregular hole in the bone with the ragged, moth-eaten margin that a destructive growth leaves behind. The team read it as a primary carcinoma of the nasopharynx. It had not stayed there. Around 30 further lesions with the same signature are scattered across the vault of his skull. The scanner found 4 or 5 more inside the bone. That is a metastatic cancer in a man in his early 30s 4,500 years ago. It is a horrifying thing to see written across a skull. Then, the microscope found something lying on top of the disease. Around the small rounded secondary lesions, there are cut marks. They are linear and short, V-shaped, in section with microstriations running along the inside. They fall in the parallel groups a sharp edge makes when it is drawn across bone more than once. And in one place, on the back of the skull, they lie directly across 2 of the lesions. There is no remodeling and no healing anywhere near them, which places them at or around the time of death. Somebody took a blade to the tumors. The authors will not say what for, and their refusal is the most important sentence in the paper. This might indicate surgical exploration or an attempt at care or treatment, they write. And then immediately, although they are perimortem, they might also indicate a post-mortem manipulation of the corpse. Those are not small alternatives. One is a physician trying and failing to cut a cancer out of a living man's head. The other is somebody opening a body after death to find out what had been killing him. The truly unsettling part is that there is no third reading, and the bone will not choose between the two. What Egyptian medicine says about tumors is on papyrus, and it is bleaker than we expect. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is a surgical treatise of 48 cases, copied out around 1600 BC from an original James Henry Breasted argued was 1,000 years older. It works from the head downward, grading every case with one of three verdicts. An ailment which I will treat, an ailment with which I will contend, an ailment not to be treated. Case 39 describes tumors with prominent heads on the breast, hot to the hand, spreading with pus and redness. The verdict is that it will be treated with the fire drill. Burn over the tumors and dress the burn as a wound. Case 45 describes the other kind. Bulging tumors spread across the breast, very cool, to the hand with no fever at all in them. They form no fluid. They do not granulate. They are hard and large and spreading. The verdict there is an ailment with which I will contend. And underneath where the treatment should go, the papyrus says only this: there is no treatment. An Egyptian surgeon could tell the difference between an abscess he could burn and a malignancy he could not. And he wrote the second down as a boundary rather than pretending otherwise. That is a more honest document than most of what followed it. The other skull says what could be done. E270 belonged to a woman of more than 50 who died between 664 and 343 BC. Between her right frontal and parietal bones is a large irregular opening with both destruction and new bone around it. The diagnosis offered is an osteosarcoma or a meningioma. She also carried two old injuries: a sharp force wound to the left frontal bone from a blade, and a depressed fracture of the left parietal from a blunt weapon. Both had healed completely. Someone tried to kill this woman with an edge, and someone tried with a club. She walked away from both and lived past 50. She survived everything other people did to her. What she did not survive was the thing growing out of her own skull in a place no blade in the country could reach. And the marks on the man's head may not be medicine at all. The same scratches that would make him the earliest known attempt at cancer surgery would, under the other reading, make him the earliest known autopsy. The difference is only whether his heart was still beating, and nobody will ever be able to tell us which. Number 4. The operation. The oath refused. In a Mesolithic burial in the Grotta del Uzzo in Trapani in Sicily, there is a woman of 20 to 25. Something small and hard lay inside her pelvis 2 centimeters by 1. In 2005, a team ran it through infrared microspectroscopy. Calcium carbonate around a nucleus of carbonate apatite. Radiocarbon puts it at roughly 6,500 BC. It is a bladder stone. It is the oldest one we have. They turn up all through the record once somebody thinks to look from pre-dynastic Egypt to Iron Age England. The largest of the early ones came from a grave at El Amra in Upper Egypt, from a boy of about 16, and it measures 65 millimeters across. A bladder stone does not behave like most things that kill people. It grows in layers in concentrated urine over years. It does not dissolve, and it does not pass. It blocks, it bleeds, and it infects in somebody who is otherwise well. There is one cure for it, and the cure is a knife. Celsus set the operation down in Rome in the 7th book of De Medicina, and it reads like a list of restrictions. Spring only. Boys of no less than 9 and no more than 14. A strong, well-trained man sits on a high stool, takes the boy from behind, and draws him backwards onto his knees. The surgeon oils his left hand, works 2 fingers into the anus, and cuts a crescent in the skin at the neck of the bladder. Celsus's own word for the procedure is dangerous. An older step-by-step account survives in the Sushruta Samhita at a date nobody has settled to within 1,000 years. It lists 8 structures that must not be touched, and it is blunt about 2 of them. Cut the urinary channels and the patient dies. Cut the seminal duct and he dies or lives without the use of himself. What makes this operation different from everything else on this list is that the most famous document in medicine names it and steps away from it. The Hippocratic Oath. In Ludwig Edelstein's translation, it reads, "I will not use the knife, not even on sufferers from stone, but will withdraw in favor of such men as are engaged in this work." It is a terrifying thing to find in an oath, one operation singled out by name in a text that otherwise deals in generalities. What the clause was for is something we have never settled. Edelstein read the oath as a Pythagorean document rather than a mainstream one. Heinrich von Staden reads the line as a boundary between trades. The problem is that somebody still had to cut. Whatever it meant, it left the most dangerous operation in the ancient world to men who were not physicians and left it there for 2,000 years. They traveled. They arrived advertised operated and moved on before the results came in. Frère Jacques Beaulieu was born in 1651 and reached Paris in 1697 at 46. Jean-Marie, chief surgeon at the Hôtel Dieu, made him prove himself on a corpse before letting him near a living patient. He was the first to cut in from the side of the perineum, not the middle. And in a single month, at 2 Paris hospitals, out of 71 patients, more than half died. The ordinary mortality at that time was 14%. Almost everything about him is disputed, including his unaudited claim of 5,000 operations. Later at Versailles, he is recorded doing 38 in a row without losing anybody. Then the disease went away. And that is the disturbing part, because nobody made it go. At the hospital in Norwich, 1,488 lithotomies were performed between 1772 and 1909. Then, the register was closed because there was nothing left to record. Writing in 1970, Batty Shaw said the epidemic had ended for a reason, still defying accurate scientific explanation. The explanation we have now is not surgical at all. It is infant feeding, where breast milk was replaced early by a paste of cereal. Phosphate dropped out of the diet, and insoluble salts came out of the urine. In 19th century England, the disease tracked the places without dairy cattle. The Stone Belt is still there. Pakistan, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Thailand, Nepal. In one Karachi series of 180 children, the peak age was 2 to 4, and 9 and 10 were boys. Open cystal lithotomy is still performed on them, and the reviews put its stone-free rate at 100%. So the operation the oath refused is still being done. What ended it in Europe was not a surgeon, and not an instrument, and not a discovery. It was milk. Number 3. The mold in a Neanderthal's mouth. Dental calculus is hardened plaque. It forms while a person is alive, and it traps whatever passes through the mouth. Unlike bone, it is almost inert, which is why it survives on teeth for tens of thousands of years. For most of the history of archaeology, it was scraped off and thrown away. In March 2017, Laura Weyrich, Alan Cooper, and a large team published what came out of it instead. The specimens were Neanderthal from Spy in Belgium and El Cidrón in Asturias, and they date to between 42 and 50,000 years ago. The Belgian individuals had been eating meat, and reeds matching rhinoceros and sheep dominate their plaque. At El Cidrón, there was no meat at all, only pine nuts, moss, and mushrooms. Then, one of the Spanish individuals, El Cidrón 1, turned out to be carrying 2 illnesses. He had an abscess in his jaw, visible on the bone. His calculus held sequences matching Enterocytozoon bienniusi, a parasite that causes chronic diarrhea, a man with a rotting tooth, and a gut infection at the same time, 48,000 years ago. He was also the only individual in the study whose plaque contained poplar. Poplar bark carries salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid. It is the ancestor of aspirin. And in the same mouth, in the same deposit, were sequences of penicillium, which the paper describes as arriving from molded herbaceous material, a painkiller, and a mold that makes antibiotics in the mouth of the one individual in the sample who was ill. That is an extraordinary sentence. The reason this entry sits at number 3 rather than number 1 is that it may not mean what it appears to. Start with what was actually measured. Nobody detected salicylic acid. Nobody detected penicillin. What was recovered was DNA matched against reference genomes that are themselves stand-ins. The rhinoceros reference is a living African white rhino, used because nobody has sequenced a woolly one, And the poplar reference is a North American tree. All we can honestly say is that reeds best, matching the poplar genus, were present. There is also more than one root into a mouth. The earlier study of the same site by Karen Hardy and Stephen Buckley in 2012 found markers of yarrow and chamomile in a young adult, plants that are bitter and carry almost no calories. But that same paper reported the first molecular evidence of wood smoke inhalation in a Neanderthal. Smoke puts plant chemistry into a mouth without anybody deciding to swallow anything. And then there is the objection that is difficult to get around, published by Laura Buck and Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in 2014. Prehistoric hunters ate the stomach contents of their prey. The practice is recorded among Inuit Cree Blackfoot and Aboriginal Australian peoples. Stomach contents are full of chewed plants that no human being chose. Bitterness, they add, does not make something not food. A year later, Sabrina Kreef and colleagues offered 2 more readings. The plants were flavoring, or the plants really were medicine, and somebody else brought them to him. Hardy and her co-authors answered in print, and their concession is the fairest line in the exchange. We can never know for sure. They wrote why yarrow and chamomile were ingested at El Cedron. What keeps the idea alive is that animals do this. In 2024, a Sumatran orangutan called Raucus, with an open wound on his face, was recorded stripping the leaves of a liana that carries antibacterial compounds. He chewed them, applied the juice to the wound repeatedly, and pressed the chewed leaves over it. That is one animal, one wound, one time. It is also exactly what self-medication looks like from the outside. And the line does run forward from the bark. In 1763, Edward Stone reported to the Royal Society that powdered willow bark broke a fever. Salicin was crystallized in 1828. And in 1899, a laboratory in Elberfeld put the acetylated version on sale under a name settled that January: aspirin. If you have taken one this year, you are using the compound that sits in genus form in the plaque of a sick Neanderthal. Which leaves the calculus. It is still on the teeth in a laboratory in Spain, holding a genus of tree and a genus of mold in the mouth of a man with an abscess and a parasite. What he understood about either of them was never written down and never drawn. That is the haunting part. It went out of the world with the last of his kind. Number 2. The leg taken off in a cave. Liang Tibo is a limestone cave in East Kalimantan in Indonesian Borneo. The karst around it holds some of the oldest dated rock art on Earth. In 2020, a team excavating the cave floor reached an articulated human burial. The individual is cataloged as TB1. Sex could not be determined. Age at death was around 19 or 20. Limestone blocks had been set above the head, and each arm and a nodule of red ochre lay next to the jaw. 3 separate dating methods were run: charcoal from the Phil uranium series and electron spin resonance on a tooth. The combined model returns 31,200 to 30,700 years ago. The lower third of the left leg was missing. In September 2022, Tim Maloney Melandri Vlock, Adam Brum, and their colleagues published what they thought had happened to it. The tibia and the fibula both end in a clean oblique section. The stumps are covered in completely remodeled bone, and the cortex of the whole limb is thinned in the way a limb thins when it has not carried weight for years. The leg bones never reached full growth, which puts the injury in childhood. They argue that the leg was cut off deliberately and that the person lived another 6 to 9 years. Then, the sentence that carries the entry. There is no evidence of infection in the left limb, which the authors note is the most common complication. None at all. A crushing accident does not produce a clean, oblique cut through 2 bones. A crocodile does not leave a limb free of infection. What the team describes instead is somebody who understood where the vessels and nerves run, well enough to take a lower leg off a child without killing them. The operation would have been nightmarish. And then a group of people kept that child alive through the weeks when the wound could still have finished the job, and afterwards through years of not walking properly. But here is where the strongest counter-argument in this entire countdown arrives. And it arrives in the same journal. In March 2023, 4 trauma surgeons from the University of Newcastle published a reply. Their reading is that this is not surgery at all. It is a common orthopedic injury, an open fracture of the lower tibia and fibula of a type they see in adolescence, followed by chronic bone infection. On that reading, the thickened bone is the shell that forms around infected bone, and the foot was lost to necrosis with the dead tissue cut through afterwards. People survived chronic osteomyelitis for years before antibiotics. That part is documented. The excavating team replied in the same issue. The section they say is too high on the shaft for the fracture pattern proposed. The force came from more than one direction. The fracture of the inner ankle that would have to be there is not there. Neither side is conceded. The surrounding evidence does not settle it, but it does not comfort the skeptics either. At Boutier-Boulancourt in Seine-et-Marne, there is an elderly man from around 4900 BC. His left arm ends in a clean oblique cut across both bumps of the elbow with dense new cortical bone over the defect and no sign of infection. Forearm and hand gone healed survived. He was buried with a polished schist axe, a flint pick, and a young sheep or goat. At Tel Unit Sita in Bulgaria, a woman in her early 60s is missing her right hand. Nobody has ever produced a survival figure for prehistoric amputation, and nobody can. The nearest real numbers are brutal. In the American Civil War, roughly 30,000 amputations killed about a quarter of the men who had them. And in the Franco-Prussian War of 1873, men in 4 died. That is with anesthesia, with tourniquets, with instruments in hospitals. So the record hands us a teenager in Borneo who lost a leg as a child, and lived an old man in France, who lost an arm, and a woman in Bulgaria who lost a hand and reached her 60s. Whether any of the 3 was operated on or simply survived, something terrible is a live question. What is not in question is what happened afterwards. Somebody in every one of those places kept alive a person who could not fetch, carry, climb, or run. They did it for years. Then they buried them with an axe, or a lamb, or a lump of red ochre laid beside the jaw. Care of that kind is older than farming, and older than pottery, and it is sitting in your own history, whether or not the cutting was surgery. Number 1. The hole in the head. In May 1997, Kurt Alt-Christian Jeunesse and colleagues published a single page in Nature about a skull from Ensisheim in Alsace. The man had died at about 50 somewhere between 5,100 and 4,900 BC. There are 2 openings in his cranium. The one at the front measures 6.5 by 6 centimeters, and the bone has closed over it completely. The one at the back spans both parietals and is 9.5 by 9. That is a hole the size of a fist. And it had only partly healed when he died. He survived the first operation for years. He survived the second, long enough for the edges to seal. And there is nothing wrong with the rest of the skull. No fracture, no infection, no tumor. Nobody can say why either hole was made. A year later, Malcolm Lilly answered with an older case from the Dnieper Rapids in Ukraine. A fully healed opening in the left frontal bone of a man over 50, dated back towards 7,300 BC on material the river's own carbon may make look older than it is. Trepanation is the oldest surgical operation we can prove, and it was invented more than once. It appears in Neolithic Europe, in North Africa, across Asia, in the Pacific, and above all in the Andes. Those peoples had no contact with each other and no way to copy the idea. There were 4 ways to do it. Scrape the bone away with a flint until it thins and lifts. Cut a circular groove and lever out the plug. Bore a ring of small holes and cut through the bridges. Or make 4 intersecting cuts and take out the square. Paul Broca, who did more than anyone to establish that this was surgery rather than damage, scraped through a thick human skull with a piece of glass in about 50 minutes. Peru has more of these than the rest of the world put together. In 2018, David Kushner, John Verano, and Ann Tittlebaum published an analysis drawn from more than 800 trepanned crania. The numbers in it are why this entry is at number 1. Long-term survival in the earliest series, from 400 to 200 BC, runs at about 40%. In samples from AD 1000 to 1400, it reaches 91. Through the Inca period, it averages between 75 and 83. Set that against the comparison the authors chose. During the American Civil War, cranial surgery killed between 46 and 56% of the men it was performed on. Surgeons working with obsidian and bronze in the Andes were losing fewer patients than surgeons working with steel in Virginia, more than 3 centuries earlier. That is an extraordinary inversion. They got there by learning. Valerie Andrushko and John Verano documented 66 individuals from 11 sites around Cusco, carrying 109 perforations between them at a survival rate of 83%. Openings got smaller over time. Surgeons avoided the areas that bleed, and the successful operations were shallow ones that never went through the dura, the tough membrane over the brain. The line between a survivable procedure and a fatal one was a couple of millimeters. Some patients came back for more. There are Peruvian skulls with 5 healed openings and one with 7. What we cannot recover is the reason. Head trauma explains a great deal of it in the Andes, where slingstones and clubs were doing the damage, and opening the skull would relieve pressure. But some trepanations sit nowhere near a fracture, and Ensisheim has no injury at all. The explanation offered most often is epilepsy. And in 2022, a group of neurologists pointed out that this can never be tested. Epilepsy is a disease of the cortex. It leaves no mark on bone. And then, there is the object nobody has ever known what to do with. The most unsettling thing in the record is not human at all. At Champdurand in the Vendée, there is a cow skull from between 3,400 and 3000 BC with a beveled opening in the right frontal bone. Around it are cut marks and scraping that match the human cases exactly. No crushing, no splintering, no gore wound. It never healed, and the team who published it could not tell whether the cutting came before or after the animal died. Either somebody was treating a cow or somebody was practicing. Braca noticed something else in the French dolmens. Discs of skull bone the size of the openings, perforated at one end, apparently to be strung and worn. He thought they came from the heads of people who survived the operation. The practice never really stopped. In 1965, Bart Hughes drilled a hole in his own skull in Amsterdam, believing it would restore the blood flow of childhood. In 1970, Amanda Fielding did the same, and Joe Mellon filmed it. But the thing that should stay with you is not the eccentrics. It is the arithmetic in the Peruvian collections. Something like 4 out of every 5 people who lay down for this in the 15th century got up again. That number was not given to them. It was built over 15 centuries, one operation at a time. On the 6 and 10, who did not get up in the earliest series. Generation after generation refined an opening, cut into a living skull, until they beat what a European hospital could manage in 1863. The skulls are in museums in Lima and Cusco, and Paris and Philadelphia, hundreds of them. The rims worn smooth by bone that grew back. Every smooth rim is somebody who walked out of the room, and not one of them left us a single word about what the hole was for. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.